Thank you, Leo. Thank you very, very much. You do need a new speechwriter, but it's all right. But I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here associated with this law school and the broader community for your leadership of this university and what you're doing for higher education and what you're doing for so many here in this larger region of the Southeast. But as you know, Elon has now spread its wings, and we have students coming from all over the country. And I think if you want to understand or see leadership in action, watch Leo Lambert. It's worth watching. Some 30 years ago, this summer, I was working in the Reagan White House. And my wife and I had escaped for a few days to visit with friends on Lake Canandaigua in the Finger Lakes in New York, about a 6-hour drive from Washington, D.C. And it was on a Sunday afternoon around 4 o'clock, as I recall, that I got a call there from the Chief of Staff at the White House, Jim Baker. And he said, David, we need you here tomorrow morning. I need you in my office at 9 o'clock. There were no planes back from Rochester, New York that night. So we piled into our car and drove those 6 hours to get back very late that night. And the next morning I got up, it was a blistering hot summer day. And I had a VW that I drove in those days, a VW Beetle. It was that tiny little car that Will Chamberlain and I each drove. And so I got into my car in my suit and started going down the George Washington Parkway as fast as I could to make this 9 o'clock meeting. It was a little tight to get there. And as we approached what's called Spout Run, where the GW Parkway comes into Spout Run, and there's a traffic buildup that goes on there. And I noticed as I was slowing down that a former law school classmate of mine passed me in his car, and we waved at each other. And then, but I knew I had to be in at 9 o'clock in the White House, and it was very important. And this was maybe 10 minutes to 9, and my VW blew a sprocket, and it just went completely out. It just went, and I had to pull it off the side of the road. And I had 10 minutes to get to the White House. And the cars were slowing down. It was about a mile to the intersection with Spout Run. And the cars were really slowing down. I thought, I think I can run fast enough to catch my classmate. So off I sprinted on the GW Parkway with my suit, with my briefcase and my jacket and a tie and this blistering hot sun. And the traffic was going just faster than I could run. And I could not get him. And people were looking out their windows at this red-faced, dripping wet giraffe running down the highway and saying, who's that jackass running down the highway? Why is he running down the highway? And I could not catch my friend. I tried and I tried. And finally, there was a young woman who was, I think, Puerto Rican, who pulled off and said, do you need help? And I said, yeah, can you drive me to the White House? And she said, I'll try. So we got in the car, and she managed to get her way through traffic. And 7.5 minutes later, I showed up at the gates of the White House. I was a wreck. I was sweating, I was profusely sweating, I was red-faced, and I burst into Jim Baker's office at 9 o'clock, right on the button. He said, I want you to meet the new Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And there was Sandra Day O'Connor. And I want you to tell you that I have never seen that car again. I asked my secretary, I said, I left my cars out there in that road. Would just call the highway patrol. We'll call whatever you have to call. I just get the car out of there. We've got work to do here. And I never saw it again. But what a pleasure it has been to see Sandra Day O'Connor so many times since. And to see her distinguished career and what she has brought to this country. We're just so delighted that you could be here and that you come back to Elon as you have. I think, she inaugurated this law school in 2006. And it was, and all of us remember that day when she brought down the mallet and we officially opened the law school, and how much pride there was in everyone that she had blessed us with her presence, and here she's back tonight. What a wonderful human being who continues to speak out on issues she cares about and has really I think, as we demonstrated, become a role model for so many. I was recently out a year or two ago, my wife and I were out in Arizona and went to the museum there, and there's not only your book, your memoir about your growing up days, but there's a book for children about your life, which we bought for our grandchildren. I gave them each a copy because she's become such a role model for so many in so many ways, and represents, I think, a tradition that we need to remember as we go forward with this law school. I think back to when I was growing up here in North Carolina far longer ago than I care to remember, that many of us in those days, Elon was just a small school down the road. I was in Durham. I grew up on a dirt road. My dad was taught at Duke. And I went to school with a lot of kids who came from tobacco families. Some of them finished high school, some didn't, some went on. One of them, John Gergen, became head of the Bar Association here in North Carolina, remains a friend. We used to play baseball together way back when. But looking back, President Eisenhower once said when he grew up, he said, when I grew up in Abilene, we were poor, but we didn't know it back then. And in many ways, we didn't have a lot. But what we did have, and it was extremely important, was that we had a sense of hope about the future. We had a real belief that the institutions and the leaders of the institutions in this country were people, upstanding people who looked out for the good of the country, who put the country first, put the quality of society first. And no matter whether you were rich or poor, you had some sense of confidence in the quality of the leadership and in the quality of the institution, so you thought things would turn out okay. They'd be fine. You were in good hands. I remember, and I have to tell you that in so many instances, the people I looked up to when I was young were lawyers. In my community, there were people who were there. The local lawyers made a real difference. We had a fellow named Arthur Larson who taught at the Duke Law School. And he was very close to President Eisenhower and was his closest advisor on international law, the importance of the United Nations, and the importance of trying to build a system of international law, which President Eisenhower stood up for. We had R.O. Everett, who was a friend and a neighbor there who had done so much for the U.S. Army. Our congressman was our family lawyer named Nick Galifianakis, and we were so proud when he went to Congress because he was Greek. Our mayor, I grew up with a Jewish mayor, and his son, his name was Mud Evans, and his son used to play in our backyard. But I don't know that Nick Galifianakis, when he went off to Congress, had any sense that his nephew would be eventually starring in a movie called Hungover or Hangover. Some of you have seen Zach Galifianakis. I'm not sure. We ought to invite him to talk one day to talk about leadership. That would be interesting. But there were so many people like that, and when I looked at sort of state government when I was growing up, and a lawyer like Terry Sanford was there, who was an inspiration for me and drew me into public life, was the first person who really drew me in. Got me involved in civil rights. Joel Fleischman, who was in his administration, who remains a dear friend to this day. But in time after time after time, the people we looked up to, the people who were the glue, and we thought of as the responsible stewards of our communities, were lawyers. And when I went to law school, we looked up to and just spoke with reverence about Brandeis, or Holmes, or Frankfurter, or Justice Jackson. And to read those opinions, they were works of beauty. They were like literature to us. And reading about Justice Holmes to this day is enormously important for me because what he stood for, a man who was wounded 3 times in the Civil War grievously, and that came back and was a great dissenter and moved on to the court. Was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt and lived on through until he was in his early 90s on the court. But Frankfurter was such a source of wisdom, or Jackson was such a source of, because of the Nuremberg trials in part. I always looked up to his opinions. And for so many of my generation, the law, and Sandra Day O'Connor, a title of one of her books is The Majesty of the Law. That's what we believed in, the majesty of the law. It was something that you sort of thought had this quality that was that was something that was exalted, and you could believe in it because it was neutral in all the battles that were going on, and rather it was about justice and about trying to weigh the scales of justice, blindfolded in a way that was impartial and that treated all citizens alike. And I thought that, and so many lawyers went into politics, and at that time, for so many years, our politics seemed to work well for the country. Our institutions enjoyed high support. President Eisenhower was served for 8 years. His average approval rating over 8 years, public approval rating over 8 years, average 64%. 64%. People trusted government. Government up until the mid-60s enjoyed 65, 70% approval rating. People trusted government to work in their interests. And we've drifted so far from that, especially in our politics. And I don't need to belabor this point because I think it's been so obvious to so many for so long, how much more polarized our politics has gotten, how much more poisoned it is, and how much more paralyzed we are as a result. And we are putting this country in serious danger. There are many around the world who now believe that we are leaving the stage and that China is coming onto the stage, but that we are in the final stages of decline that's been going on for some time. And they think that decline is picking up speed. If you go to talk to the Chinese, they believe that very deeply. And where that's going to lead, no one knows. We do know that it's dangerous when one power rises and another power is in decline. That's often a time when war comes. That's what historians tell us. I just was with Henry Kissinger the other night. He came to Harvard after 40 years, first time back on the Harvard campus, after 40 years, but to heal a rift. But he very deeply believes that that's a dangerous time and we have to handle this partnership carefully. But it's not just about the international side. It's really about the way we live with each other. It's about the quality of life in our society and whether our politics delivers for our citizenry so that we don't have what we're now facing. And that's not only just a weak recovery, but we have a working class in this country that's in serious, serious trouble. You don't have to read Charles Murray. You can read a lot of other people to understand that we have some issues not only of inequality, but we've got issues of declining social mobility. Inequality has been with us throughout our history. But what we've always had is there have been a ladder up for those who really worked hard and played by the rules. There were ways up. You could still make it in this country. We just had this panel this afternoon and what was so striking about the leadership panel, the first panel out of the box today, was how many of the individuals there started with modest means. They came from modest backgrounds, and they were self-made people, and they were now major figures in the law, and from various backgrounds, and gone on various journeys. But they all came from modest factors. Today in this country, the most important indicator of how you're going to do in life is which zip code you're born into. That was not the case. You could be born into a rural North Carolina zip code and you could still make it in life, as many people did. And our politics has not been responsive to that. As I say, I don't need to berate that. But what is of concern tonight, especially in this group, is the degree to which the kind of polarization and the ideological rigidity that we've seen in our politics is coming into the law and into the way law is resolved and how people are now thinking about lawyers. I mean, the reputation of lawyers has never been as high as it should be, but it has suffered here in recent years. Tony Kronman, who was the dean of the Yale Law School and wrote a book about the lost lawyers, it was a wonderful book, distinguished between two types of lawyers that he thought we were now seeing just in the general legal profession. And that's one type of lawyer that's in a tradition of being very slavish to their clients. Whatever the clients want is what they will do. Versus a second tradition, the older tradition of lawyer statesmen, of lawyers who, they show fidelity to their clients, but they also recognize that they're officers of the court, and they have a fiduciary responsibility toward the courts and toward the law, and that they have some larger role as counselor to their clients to try to help them. Today in our conversation, we talked about that in the early panel about what does a lawyer do if he thinks that someone is going off track? How do they advise him? And one of the panelists said, well, You make sure that they understand what the options are. I think it was your comments, weren't they? What the options are, and make sure that they at least consider what that is. Well, I've experienced this firsthand, the difference between the slavish to your client versus a lawyer-statesman. I experienced it even longer ago, 40 years ago, when I first it hit me between the eyes. I worked in the Nixon White House. We had a lawyer, we had a general counsel named John Dean. John Dean went to jail because he was paid such slavish a deference to his bosses. And I remember when I was asked to write the resignation letter for Richard Nixon the night before he left, and I asked Al Haig when he called me, well, to whom should the resignation letter for the president be addressed? It was a big surprise to me. And he said, I said, are we supposed to write it to the President Pro Tem of the Senate, the Chief Justice of the United States, to God, to whom should this be addressed? And he said, I don't know, consult the lawyers. Well, I started to go see our general counsel, and then I realized he was in the slammer. So I went to see our general counsel. I went to see our deputy general counsel, and he turned out to be a fellow named Fred Fielding. And Fred Fielding was the lawyer-statesman. He was the person who resisted all these temptations to be so slavish to the counsel. And he was the person who kept me out of trouble, kept a lot of people out of trouble. And he helped me through that, as he helped me through so many other experiences. And Fred Fielding has gone on to live a very honorable life in a distinguished way, and practicing law, being on national commissions, and one thing and another. He probably never made as much money as John Dean did from books. But he could put his head down on the pillow at night and rest a peaceful sleep. And there was a big difference. And I think those distinctions still exist today. And we ought to be very thoughtful about that, about how much respect people have for lawyers in general. There's an old story, perhaps you've heard, about three fellows who were out on a long walk through the hills of North Carolina, and as night approached, they realized they didn't have any place to stay. There was no motel around or anything like that, and they saw this farm nearby, and they ran up to the farmer and said, "Can you put us up for the night?" And he said, "Well, I'd be delighted to put you up, but I only have two beds, but I do have a stall in my barn if that's okay." And they said, "Well, okay, well, we better take those accommodations." So they, as dusk settled and became dark, there were three men, where one was an ambassador to the United Nations, the second was a White House counselor, and the third was a lawyer. So as night fell, the ambassador, understanding the etiquette better than anyone else, said, I guess I'll go sleep in the barn. So off he went into the night. About 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. And it was the ambassador. He said, "I'm very, very sorry, but I'm Hindu, and there's a cow in that barn. I couldn't possibly sleep in that barn overnight." And I said, "Well, okay." So the White House counselor got up and said, "Well, I guess I'll go to the barn." Off he went into the night. And 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Sure enough, it's the White House counselor, and he said, "There's pig in that barn. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I really don't feel comfortable sleeping in that barn overnight." The lawyer said, "Okay." Got up, he scratched, belched, said, "I guess I'll go off to the barn." And off he went into the night. And 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. And sure enough, it was the cow and the pig. So we do have these issues about the legal profession. And you could cite various polls about where the legal profession stands. There's a poll out from Gallup now, favorability ratings for the legal profession out of a list of 20 professions, 15th. On trust, another poll from Gallup, they're about 15 out of 20 as well on the question of trust. Do you trust the legal profession? Those are issues we need to seriously consider as we have students go through here. But there is this one additional issue that I think it's only appropriate, and I defer to Justice O'Connor, who can talk more deeply about all of this than I can and with far more knowledge. And this is a delicate subject. But I do worry, as I think many of you must, about the degree to which the judiciary is becoming politicized, and at least is being seen as politicized, which is, in this case, respect and moral standing, moral authority, moral legitimacy of the United States Supreme Court depends very, very heavily upon people believing that the justices there are actually weighing the scales of justice very, very carefully. and trying to be the umpires. You know, Chief Justice Roberts himself, in his testimony as he was, during his nomination process, he said, as on the court, I believe that our role is to call balls and strikes. We are not the batters or the pitchers. We call the balls and strikes. People do not come to baseball games to watch the to watch the umpires. That was right, but that is not the perception a growing number of people in this country have. And this issue is once again coming to a head this summer, as we all know, as the court deliberates over the question of the Affordable Care Act, often known as Obamacare, even by the president, and about its constitutionality. And the fear is growing, especially after the testimony recently, that what some people thought, Jeffrey Toobin is a colleague of mine at CNN, who felt strongly the court would rule in favor of the act, and it might even be 6-3, that this could go 5-4 against the act. Now, there are two things about that. One is that I think it's terribly, terribly unfortunate that that in too many instances the mainstream media is making the argument that if it goes 5-4 to strike down the act, that the judges have been entirely guided by ideology. And if it goes in favor of the act, that somehow they made a neutral decision. I frankly think that's unfair to the conservatives on the court, there are legitimate questions about the Commerce Clause and about the reach of the Commerce Clause, about the limitations on the Commerce Clause that are hard to resolve. The court has had to take up the Commerce Clause on many, many occasions, and some of these issues are not resolved. There are legitimate differences. So my strong hope is if it goes down, that the mainstream press and others are at least open to the fact that people may have resolved this based on their honest understanding of the law and of the Constitution. Because I think otherwise we're just going to be in a mess about how the court acts. But there is also true, and Justice O'Connor has experienced this herself, it is also true that we have increasingly come into a period in which 5-4 decisions have become much more frequent than they once were in the history of the court. Very closely divided opinions. It's worth noting that prior to World War II, the highest number of 5-4 decisions over the life of any Chief Justice, on average, the highest number in any year was 4%. 4% of the cases went to 5-4, up for the entire history of the court up to World War II. Those numbers started climbing in the 50s and 60s, and during the life of the court under Chief Justice Roberts, we're around 22%. I don't have the latest data up there, but it's around 22%. That is a much, much higher number. Now, that's not to say that all of that's ideologically driven. It is to say that the country worries about it. It is to say that the country is deeply concerned about it. One of the reasons that all of us respect Justice O'Connor as much as we do is the evidence seems to suggest that on decision after decision, when she was a swing vote, she was doing it honestly. She was doing it as the law should be practiced. And when she came down one way or the other, in general, it meant, I think for almost everybody who was following, it certainly did for me, if that's what she thinks, I trust that judgment. Even she had to go through a difficult time with the Bush v. Gore case, when that came down 5-4. But the redeeming quality about the 5-4, even I have a lot of Democratic friends who believe that they were robbed, and you could hear that from various people for a fairly long time. But the redeeming feature in that case was that two of the justices who were in the minority were appointed by Republican presidents. So it wasn't just a Republican versus Democratic divide. There were people on the Republican side who voted on Vice President Gore's side. That made a big difference. But now we're in a situation, if it goes 5-4 on the Obamacare case, we're going to have, if it goes to 5-4 against Obamacare, the very strong likelihood is we're going to have 4 Democratic appointed in a minority and 5 Republican appointed in a majority. And that is not a healthy situation. And we need to get out of this somehow. I do not think it is healthy And frankly, I've seen what happens in the White House. The White House comes under enormous pressure. I just guarantee you, after President Bush Sr. appointed Justice Souter, and Justice Souter then did not vote according to the way many conservatives wanted, there were a lot of conservatives who beat up on the president and put enormous pressure on his Republican son to ensure there were no more Souters, because nobody wanted that. And that happens on the left too. If people are judged increasingly, are you going to be a safe choice? Are you going to vote our way? And there's enormous pressure on the White House and on politicians in the White House to find somebody who passes muster with your party. And that is not what I remember presidents doing in earlier days when they really did look for equality. When President Reagan went and asked Justice Connor to serve, I can guarantee it was on the basis of quality. I know something about that decision, and it was very, very important. So this issue is a very delicate one. It's one that needs to be treated with great care, but I'm just saying to you that the country, we're walking on the edge. If we let the Supreme Court slip away from us as a respected institution, one whose judgments are followed because we believe they are the supreme law of the land, that we believe they have been decided impartially, we're going to lose something very precious. I lived in North Carolina in the 1950s, and I can tell you that when Brown versus Board of Education came down, it was extraordinarily important here in North Carolina that was a 9-0 decision. If it had come down 5-4, we would not have followed the law here. There would have been a pushback. It would have been part of our politics for the next 20 years. Who's going to appoint whom to the court? Who's going to control the court? And it would have been a mess. It would have been a genuine mess. We owe Chief Justice Warren a debt of gratitude that he worked very hard. Histories have been written about this, how he worked very hard to bring a 9-0 decision, because the unanimity of that decision meant for all of us in North Carolina, especially for white folks, pay attention, guys, this is a real deal. These are people who are saying this is what the law requires, and we're on both sides of the aisle. We're telling you that this is what's right. And at that point, our political leaders here, many of whom resisted it, eventually had no choice but to go along with it. And it changed the life of this state. And frankly, it liberated us. I've argued in front of some of you before, one of the best things that ever happened to the South, one of the best things that ever happened to this state was the Civil Rights Movement. And the changes that came, once the walls started coming down between the races, the walls started coming down between the South and the rest of the country. And it made a huge difference, not just in the lives of African Americans, it made a huge difference in the lives of Caucasians here in this state. And the Warren Court had a lot to do with the legitimacy of that whole effort. And so from my point of view, what we need to be thinking about now is Justice O'Connor has spoken out frequently about the need for more dialogue and more deliberation and more thoughtful deliberation on these issues that divide us so much. I totally agree with that. I think that and listen, I'm part of a press that makes us worse, not better. I fully recognize that I'm part of the problem here, and as a participant, and one way or another. It is also true, as she has argued, that civic education is extremely important. We need to make sure the younger generation understands not just what our institutions were intended to be, but why they worked in the past. What made them work? What was it about bipartisanship? What was it about statesmanship? What was it about the compromise? Compromise has been a part of our politics from the day we formed the Constitution, wrote the Constitution. It was embedded in the Constitution. And time after time, we've been willing to find compromise. It has not been a dirty word in the past. We need to have the younger generation understand that. We need to make sure the younger generation at places like this at law school come out understanding the highest traditions of the law and what has made this such a special thing, why this has to be a government of laws and not of men, why that is so crucial, why the majesty of the law does matter so much. It's not just what we teach in the classroom, it's the culture in which we try to build through that. And finally, I would also argue, I am less than optimistic than I would like to be about the capacity of my own generation to resolve many of the most difficult problems facing the country. I still have hope, but frankly, my generation has not performed as well as I had hoped. But I have enormous hope, I have enormous faith in the generation that's coming people who are in school now. I am enormously encouraged by the quality, by the idealism, by the drive, by the fact that people are willing to put aside this rancid politics that we have and try to work in a different way. You know, I'm involved with Teach for America. I see the young people who are coming out into our schools. I'm delighted we're talking about trying to get more Teach for America folks to come here. I work with veterans coming out of our military now, coming back to school. They're some of the finest students at Harvard right now are veterans. It's one of the silver linings of this 10 years of war that we've got terrific people who are taking off their uniforms and care. And I think we have, those of us who are older in this room, we have a real opportunity with this younger generation, many of whom are represented right here at this law school and at this university. We have an opportunity to help this generation understand the traditions of the past and renew the best of America. Thank you very, very much.